everybody. This is Eve Ewing. I'm the curator of the Black Freedom Lecture Series. And before we get started with our amazing talk this week, there are two things I want to remind you to do. The first thing is, if you are not already signed up for our newsletter, you definitely want to do that. It's how you're going to find out about all of our incredible speakers and enter a raffle to win books and find out about questions and readings and all the cool stuff. So go to our website, blackfreedomlectures.org/newsletter, and sign up if you haven't done that already. The second thing is, we would really love this to be a collective learning experience. So if you haven't done so already, we encourage you to get together with a squad, a group of friends, or just one friend. Hook up with somebody and say, hey, I'm watching this thing, I'm reading this stuff, and I would love to have some conversations with you about it. Get together so that this is not a thing we're doing alone. That's it. Welcome. Really geeked to have you, and let's get into it.
I'm Barbara Ransby, and I'm a professor, historian, a writer, and a longtime activist. And I want to just acknowledge at the outset, this is an impossibly large set of topics for one lecture, but I'm going to do my best and give it a shot. Let me start with Marxism. Now, I want to say as a preface that I was asked to speak to a general audience in an accessible language. So for all my colleagues who are Marxist scholars or anti-Marxist scholars, if you will, you'll have to forgive me if I don't cite every one of Marx's texts or cover all the nuances of neo-Marxist debates, of which, of course, there are many. But Marxism in generally refers to the ideas, social scientific philosophy, and teachings of the European intellectual and philosopher Karl Marx. Marx was born in Germany in 1818. He died in London in about 1883. He is probably one of the most, if not the most influential political thinker of the 19th and 20th centuries. He has had his work translated into dozens of languages around the world, debated in thousands of forums, and his most powerful work, published between 1867 and 1894, and part of it published posthumously, were the three-volume tome Das Kapital, or Capital. It is the most cited social science text published before 1950 anywhere in the world, So that gives you a sense of the breadth of Marx's influence. Marx's second most important work, written with his friend and collaborator Friedrich Engels, is the Communist Manifesto. Again, widely circulated, widely discussed, cited, and debated. That was published in 1848. Marx's focus was on the emergence of capitalism as a political and economic system. He focused on the workings of capitalism and the future trajectory of capitalism. And he did so as a scientist, not just as a person morally opposed to the excesses and ravages of capitalism. So although his focus was on the British and European working class, his ideas have had a wide appeal. They've been engaged, applied, and critiqued the world over. Marx's ideas have traveled much further than Marx himself ever did in his lifetime. So what really defines Marxist thought, and I would say neo-Marxist thought? Well, it is a school of thought that has many variants, so it's not a single thing. And we can say first and foremost, Marx was a vociferous critic of the ravages of capitalism as a system that replaced the land-based feudal system that preceded it. Capitalism, according to Marx, is based on exploitation, greed, private property, and profit. And it is defined by the struggle between two social classes with antithetical, that is, opposite interests: the proletariat, that is, the workers, and the bourgeoisie, or ruling class, that is, the wealthy elites who own what is termed the means of production. Now, these are Marxist terms, and they get mediated and modified and amplified, over time. So workers essentially sell their labor to capitalists, who then exploit that labor to produce goods and services for a profit, and I'll come back to that. Those features of exploitation are built into the DNA of capitalism. They're not accidents, they're not corollaries, they're not unfortunate consequences. The exploitation of workers in order to extract value from their labor is one of the core features and functions of a capitalist economy. Capitalism is based on the ability of capitalists to derive profit from workers' labor through exploitation, and that profit comes from something we call surplus value. For example, if you work in a factory or a shop that produces shoes, you make 10 pairs of shoes each day, sandals, sneakers, whatever, and each pair of shoes sells for a mere $50 in today's market. But you don't get $50 back in wages as a worker. And you might say, well, that might make sense because someone has to buy the leather and the cloth and the equipment to make those shoes. Okay, so once you pay for the equipment and the materials that go into the product, say that costs $20 per pair of shoes. Well, then you get paid $30 for your labor, right? The labor that turns that leather and other ingredients into a usable commodity. Nope. For each pair of shoes that you make, you don't get that $30. Not under capitalism, you don't. Why is that? Because the profit system says that a person who owns the factory, the shop, the equipment, by virtue of ownership alone, gets the lion's share of what those shoes sell for on the market. And the less he or she pays you, the worker, the bigger his or her profit. That difference between what the boss pays you as a wage, what goes into actually the product itself, and the market value that it sells for equals surplus value. So then you can see why Marx would argue that there's an antagonistic relationship between the well-being of workers and the tendency of capitalist owners to maximize profit. This leads to class struggle. Workers go on strike, workers struggle for a higher wage, and capitalists do everything in their power to minimize those efforts. Now, I've read a lot of Marxist literature over the years, not everything, but I will tell you there's a way in which growing up as a working class kid in Detroit, the daughter of Black working class parents who were first sharecroppers and then factory workers, I learned a lot about surplus value even before I had a name for it. It was the reason my father and his fellow union members went on strike or had to threaten to strike in order to get 20 cents or 50 cents more an hour for their work. And they worked pretty hard. And it's why the bosses who made millions never got their hands dirty, could live in fancy houses, drive fancy cars, go on nice vacations. That was my childhood introduction to capitalist exploitation. And of course, we see this today as people like Jeff Bezos and others make billions of dollars, more dollars than we can even imagine, while in very close proximity to them in the very same country, sometimes in the very same city or state, people are hungry, struggling, and scraping to get by. There is a moral judgment we can make about that. But Marx had a kind of calculated scientific assessment of that too, that we need a different kind of system because there's no way that capitalism, according to its own logic and rules, can correct itself for the best interests of the society. Other important points to mention in terms of Marxist thinking and Marxist frameworks: the state, that is the government under capitalism, is not a neutral entity. In fact, the constitutions and legal and criminal codes in a capitalist society first and foremost protect the sanctity of private property. It is legal, for example, under capitalism to starve to death, even if there's unused food in close proximity, if that hungry person does not have the money to pay for it. It is legal for an unhoused person to literally freeze to death, even when there are vacant and abandoned homes nearby, if he or she does not have the money to pay rent. That's the moral code of capitalism, and the state upholds it. The role of the state then is to regulate the relationship between capitalists and workers, and among workers and capitalists, in order to ensure the smooth running of the economy overall, and to preserve the right of capitalists to continue to make profit. So according to Marx, the injustices of capitalism inevitably lead to class struggle. He predicted that would also inevitably lead to socialist revolution and a socialist society, which would then in terms of his formula, would lay the foundation for a communist society, which is a classless or egalitarian society. Now, we did not see that. There have been socialist revolutions, but we have not seen a classless society. And we can talk about a whole bunch of reasons why. Many people have written extensively about why they think that's the case. But that was kind of Marx's prediction. Another prediction, of course, was that revolution, socialist revolution, would happen in the most industrially advanced countries, which of course also didn't happen when we think of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917 and the Chinese Revolution in 1949. So there's much more to say about all this. And again, people have spent their careers debating various aspects of Marxist thought. But Marx argued that his ideas were living science. So he intended for them not to be static, but dynamic. He never intended for them to be dogmatic. So we have to always ask the question, what does Marx or any other philosopher or radical thinker have to offer in our own time? And we can't exempt ourselves from the heavy lifting required to analyze the world around us in order to change it. Marx offers some important contributions and an important foundation in that regard, but clearly not all the answers. When we think of our time and Marx's time, for example, Marx never drove a car, something that's a part of our daily existence in such a fundamental way. He never used a telephone. He never rode on an airplane, the staples of a high-tech, society of the 21st century. He lived in a different time. He understood a lot about the time that he lived in. But we have new challenges, new forms of exploitation and oppression, new dynamics in social relations, all of which has to be mapped by those of us who are living and experiencing it. So I want to say that there have been many Marxist thinkers, theorizing over the course of many decades. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the period after the end of colonialism in Africa and a move toward independence, Marxist and socialist ideas took hold and melded with indigenous notions of communalism, some called African socialism, throughout the continent. Those who are part of a whole constellation of Marxist thinkers, are people who come from Latin America, people who come from Africa and the Caribbean, people who were trying to cast off the yoke of oppression that rendered many of the people of those places in the world, the global South, in poverty and suffering under colonialism. Look to Marxism and look to various socialist ideas and frameworks, again, combined with their own understandings of what was happening on the ground in their experiences, experiences that Marx did not have. That's a materialist approach towards social change, is to look around us and to apply ideas and theories to the material conditions of our lives. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, who led the Cuban revolutionaries to oust the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1959, very influenced by Marx. Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, some of the most talented muralists and artists of Mexico, were Marxists, socialists, and communists. And legendary figures like Claudia Jones, the Trinidadian-born communist who was imprisoned and exiled in the US and then went on to found what became the Notting Hill Carnival in London. And even W.E.B. Du Bois, whose work, his masterpiece, Black Reconstruction, and many of his works, prolific Black intellectual, was ultimately someone who embraced Marxist ideas, who left the United States and died in exile in independent Ghana. So I give all these examples to say that while Marx himself was European, was German, was focused on a lot of the dynamics of capitalism that unfolded in Europe, other people then adopted and adapted and engaged and critiqued Marxist ideas who were in fact not European and not operating in a European context. An important critic and interlocutor with Marxism was my friend and colleague, Cedric Robinson. Cedric Robinson, he and I worked together on the Race and Class Journal board for many years. Cedric died a number of years ago, but his imprint is still being felt. He was a critic of capitalism, but also felt that Marxism had not looked carefully enough at the issue of race and racialization as critical components of capitalist systems, that in fact, in Cedric's genealogy, race and racialization predated capitalism itself. But he saw it as a constituent part of the emergent systems of capitalism. In his 1981 book, Black Marxism, he talks about a liberatory and anti-capitalist Black radical tradition. borrowing in part from the South African struggle against capitalist apartheid in South Africa. Cedric argued, and many of us have argued today, that we cannot understand capitalism without also understanding its intimate, constitutive relationship to white supremacy and racism from the very start. That is, stolen Black bodies and the labor they produce were the capital on which colonial and later American capitalism was built. Around the world, colonization and the pillage and plunder of many parts of the global South was fueled by capitalist greed, but it was also fueled by the ideology of white supremacy that helped to give it cover and justify it. So many sectors of the predominantly white left today and various apologists for sort of white left colorblindness refuse to confront this reality and do so to their and our detriment. Really, again, if we look at the two pillars of US capitalist class formation, it was that theft of indigenous land and genocide against indigenous people. It was the theft of Black bodies and Black labor that gave capitalism its start. Our ancestors' bodies and stolen labor were the capital on which capitalism was built. So even though Black Marxism, Cedric's really influential book, has become more influential actually since his death, but Black Marxism is a critique of the limits of Marxism. At the same time, it talks about the need to think beyond capitalism toward Black freedom and human freedom. But other people operating in a Marxist tradition, other people who borrowed from Marxist ideas or considered themselves Marxists, who were a part of the Black freedom struggle and the Black liberation movement, include the famed Trinidadian socialist C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James, who wrote probably one of the most important and foundational histories of the Haitian Revolution, Black Jacobins, was himself a socialist. And Black feminists, the Black feminists who formed the Combahee River Collective in the 1970s, Barbara Smith and others, were unapologetic socialists. Angela Davis, who many people know from her status as a political prisoner in the early 70s and later as a feminist abolitionist, is also a Marxist who subscribes to socialist politics and worldview. And of course, African anti-colonial leaders, some of whom I've already mentioned, Caribbean anti-colonial leaders, who were not only revolutionaries and freedom fighters who fought their own fights, but were intellectuals, were people who wrote and thought and spoke in very complex historical and theoretical ways about understanding capitalist and colonial systems. I'm thinking now, of course, of people like Walter Rodney in Guyana, Amilcar Cabral in Guinea, who did so much to deepen and thicken and make more robust our understandings of racial capitalism and empire, both of whom were brutally assassinated because the threat of those ideas was so intense. So all of this is a shorthand teaser and a partial response to the question, what is Marxism and what is its relationship to the Black freedom movement? It gives us some sense of the reach of socialist and Marxist ideas into Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the US Black freedom movement, but it also decenters Marx as Marx the man and talks about a larger tradition of dissecting capitalism and mapping a way forward in terms of a different kind of system. Let me segue now to talk about the related theme of anti-fascism. And as with everything else, I want to link this to Black radicalism and the global Black freedom movement, building off of our understanding of Marxism. Building off of that understanding, we have to talk about the nature of the state. And by the state, of course, I mean the apparatuses of the governments, the laws, the courts, the entire structure that governs modern society. Marx, as I said before, had this framework that the state serves the interests of the dominant class, which of course, the capitalist class, and not just people who have money, but people who own the means of production, right? The millionaires, the multimillionaires and billionaires, because with that ownership comes a certain kind of social capital, right? What research they fund, what media they support, what political candidates they support, et cetera, all adds to an elaborate web of social capital as well as the actual money they have in the bank. So when we talk about capitalism, we're not talking about somebody who owns a little motorboat or a bodega on the corner. We're talking about people who, through their wealth and ownership, really own and control large sectors of the society. Now, that's important to say because when we talk about fascism and in turn anti-fascism, we have to talk about governance on a continuum. So, fascism, crudely defined as a sort of dictionary definition, is an authoritarian dictatorship marked by ultranationalism and the forcible suppression of opposition, suspensions of rights, dissent, protest, and criticism of the government, and usually characterized by the rise of dictators in the 20th century, like Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, etc. It also includes often a form of xenophobia and racism. But fascism is a form of capitalist rule. It is not a form of socialist redistribution, and that's important to note. So, at one end of the governing spectrum is this sort of fascist authoritarianism. At the other end of the spectrum, we might think of what people call liberal or bourgeois democracy. That is, a set of laws and rules and rights and protections that still facilitate the dominance of the capitalist class, but do so with certain concessions to working class people and the population in general. We saw, that is, the emergence of fascist movements in the 20th century in Italy, Germany, and Spain, with Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco, respectively. But from the moment that fascism emerged, there were anti-fascist movements. Underground movements in Germany, resistance movements in Spain, and perhaps most notably the international brigades that sent nationals from other countries around the world who were not loyal to a single nation state or a flag, but to a set of values and principles and ideals, who fought side by side against the rise of fascism in Spain. So let me also say this about fascism and anti-fascism. Sadly, tragically, we see neo-fascist movements today all around the world, and a uniquely American form of fascism emergent in this country, with racist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, xenophobic, white nationalists. So fascism has always taken different forms. The fascism that emerged in Spain was different than the fascism that emerged in Germany, etc. We also see a link to authoritarian dictators around the world who are also on the rise, and they may not conform specifically to our dictionary definition of fascism, but they definitely lean in that direction. They are brutally repressive, they are xenophobic, and they promote the sort of violent arm of the state as the preferred mode of governance, as opposed to a more liberal version of that. We see that in the rule of Bolsonaro in Brazil, the vicious power of Duterte in the Philippines, Erdogan in Turkey, and Modi's Hindu nationalism in India. And of course, we saw this with the rise of Trump and Trumpism in this country. In the US, the form of rhetoric is a little bit different and a bit twisted if you listen carefully, wrapped up with the notion of individual liberty rather than the notion of giving up individual liberties for the sake of a strong nation. But in actuality, the fanatical, blind, loyalty to a single corrupt would-be dictator in the case of Trump is the mindless forfeiture of liberties and certainly the curtailment of freedom for large numbers of immigrants, Black protesters and Black communities, striking workers, etc. Now, the question was not about fascism, but about anti-fascism. So again, everywhere that dictatorships have arisen, resistance has arisen. In Germany, under the Nazis, there were leftists who fought the Nazi thugs in the street, and then there was the resistance that fought underground. Jews participated in the fight against Nazism in Germany and elsewhere, But also other groups did as well, because one of the features of fascism in Germany, while it targeted millions of Jews and the inexcusable, morally indefensible results of the concentration camps are just devastating tragedies of history. They also targeted communists and LGBT folks in the same way that Jews were forced to wear a Star of David to designate them from other members of the German population. Gays and lesbians were forced to wear the pink triangle to designate them from other sectors of the population. In Germany, student groups like the White Rose distributed anti-Nazi leaflets as a form of nonviolent opposition. The state's response, however, was quite violent, and many of those young people rounded up and executed. Black people were also involved in anti-fascist organizing in the 20th century. Nearly 100 Black volunteers participated in the international brigades during the Spanish Civil War against Franco. There were multiple national groups of soldiers, many of them socialists and communists, that went to push back against fascism in that country. The Lincoln Brigade was formed by Black and other volunteers in this country. People like Elward McDaniels from Mississippi went to fight in Spain, Canute Frankson, Oliver Law, Solaria Key, a Black nurse originally from Georgia who ended up in Harlem. And of course, people like Paul and Islanda Robeson, the great poet Langston Hughes, all visited Spain to monitor what was happening there, express their solidarity with anti-fascist fighters. And through the streets of Harlem, organizations were formed and marches were held to protest Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. So a very rich anti-fascist tradition within the Black freedom movement. Now, I was also asked to say a little bit about Black internationalism. And what I'll say there is that Black internationalism we can think of in two categories. One is forms of Pan-Africanism, which again is a broad tradition. W.B. Du Bois convened some very important Pan-Africanist congresses in his time in 1919 in Paris and then in Manchester. Others very much a part of that Pan-Africanist tradition of linking people from the African diaspora, particularly under colonialism, linking them in opposition to European colonialism, but extending beyond the colonial period as well. Even today, we look to the Black world, the way in which the Black diaspora has spread out around the world as a result of colonialism, wars, migration, etc. We have Black populations virtually all over the world. But we think of countries like Haiti, the place where there was the first successful revolution against slavery, a place very close to my heart. We think of struggles in South Africa, in Brazil, right now, where there's a large Black population resisting both capitalism and white supremacy. And we think of the prominence of women in all of these struggles. And another part of this discussion really could be to incorporate the role of patriarchy in empire, in racial capitalism, and in white supremacy itself. That is another piece of the puzzle of oppressive systems that have, held us all in this state. But back to the question of Black internationalism. People like Ella Baker, who I studied for many years, who didn't travel very far in her life, traveled very far in terms of her thinking about the need for global solidarity. So Pan-Africanism being the first category of Black internationalism, but a broader global solidarity being the other category. SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panther Party, taking strong stands against the US war in Vietnam in the 1960s and early 70s, taking a strong stand against imperialist aggression in other places around the world, being influenced very much by the Cuban Revolution, being influenced very much by the struggle against French colonialism in Algeria, and many of the people in the 1960s who found themselves in exile went to places in the world like Cuba and Algeria that gave them refuge. So that notion of transnational or international solidarity was reciprocal, was not just a one-way street. A lot to be said about all those places on the planet, about all those struggles, but that principle of internationalism, that we can't confine our struggle for liberation to one country or confine it within national boundaries and borders, has been a constant in Black radical thought, really going back to the very early 20th century, really going back to the 19th century, when the anti-slavery movement and people like Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells went on speaking tours outside of the United States to call for an end to the enslavement of Black people. Today, the movement for Black Lives and other parts of the contemporary Black freedom movement have been very strong and very clear about international solidarity. Movement for Black Lives has built ties with struggles in South Africa, have built ties with people fighting for land and justice and freedom in Brazil, have built ties with people in London who have formed solidarity organizations with the current Movement for Black Lives, pivoting on the question of police violence, but not limited to that. The question of Palestine has also been a really important and sometimes lightning rod for international solidarity. And right now, in May of 2021, we see the Israeli government being particularly brutal in its bombings of Gaza, in its attempts to evict Palestinian families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in Jerusalem. Many Black organizations have spoken out against these injustices around the world and spoken in solidarity for the people who are suffering from these kind of policies, practices, and forms of domination. So that is, in a nutshell, my attempt to stimulate some conversation about these big, broad, far, far, far-reaching topics. I just want to say, at this moment in time where we have come through this unprecedented global pandemic, we are coming through it, it's not over, where we have seen the protests in this country really unprecedented. Millions of people in the street around issues of state violence and racist police violence. We've seen people around the world rising up against various forms of injustice, massive demonstrations in Europe, in Asia, in the Caribbean, in Latin America. It is a moment that is ripe for change. It is a moment where talking about Black internationalism, talking about the dangers of fascism, and talking about how we understand, engage, and rethink the challenges of Marxism and socialism. So I'm happy to offer these fairly brief comments as a point of departure for hopefully what will be lively and extended discussions.